50 minutes, and we'll 55, and we'll go like 35. I can claim no credit for it, but I like people can eat cafe style. Look at that. That's how we do lunch. I'm not sure how we've done that before. So, and I am live here. So, there's Carolyn. Yeah, you should be on. Am I good to go? Good morning or happy midday. I'm John Fortier, the Director of Governmental Studies here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here on a very timely topic, cyber threats to campaigns and elections. And we're here with two experts on the eve of a release of interesting work that has come out of their work at Stanford University. I will briefly introduce them. We're going to jump into the many issues that we have related to social media and campaigns and elections, and then we'll come to you for your questions as we conclude the event. So to my left is Nate Persily. He is a professor of law at Stanford Law School, has been involved in the electoral and election world for a long time in the fields of campaign finance, was a research director to the President's Commission on Election Administration on fixing our voting systems, sits on the Kofi Annan Commission, a number of things related to both domestic and foreign issues relating to election law and threats that we face. Alex Stamos is also at Stanford University. He is part of a new entity called the Internet Observatory, which is part of a new center that Nate is also leading here, and they'll give us a little bit more about what they're up to. But Alex was also the head of cybersecurity at Facebook, and has also been at a number of other platforms and internet companies. I believe a graduate of Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken. So spent some time in that area. So we're going to have a conversation, but first I guess I want to give a little bit of an opportunity to wave around your very interesting report that has come out and tell us a little bit about what is happening at Stanford in these areas. Nate.
Nate, tell them what they've won.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to plug. So this is the first report out of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center that I'm leading with Dan Boneh, a computer scientist. It is the center at Stanford, really started by the Hewlett Cyber Initiative, Hewlett Foundation Cyber Initiative, that deals with all kinds of research and issues surrounding democracy, technology, and security. And so we've got two programs that deal with security. One, the Internet Observatory, which you mentioned, that Alex Stamos is running, and Andy Grotto runs another one. He used to work in cybersecurity at the White House. And then there's two programs on the Internet and democracy, my program that I run with Frank Fukuyama and Rob Reich, and another one called the Global Digital Policy Incubator, run by Eileen Donahoe and Larry Diamond. So we launched this center just this past week, and Mike McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, who's head of the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, was the editor of this report where he tried to get Stanford professors together to try to write what would be kind of a 9/11 report on the 2016 election, but really focusing on recommendations for 2020 and beyond.
Great. So I'm going to start out and ask Alex a question. I think before we get to all of the interesting recommendations in the report, I want to really think about what the kind of threats had been and what we're looking forward to in this next election. You were sitting at Facebook. You've been in other places seeing some of the things come in. These issues cover a wide variety of topics, from, again, election administration, campaign finance, advertising, disinformation, foreign influence versus what's proper content that you might want to regulate in domestic areas. So why don't you give us a sense of, why don't we go back and say, what were the threats that you saw that alarmed you, that you wanted to call out to the public, and what do we need to know about that, and then going forward, what should we be thinking about 2020?
So to restrict ourselves just to attacks against elections, there's really kind of four areas of attempted influence by the Russians in 2016. The first was the social media campaign, so the trolling campaign. There was the hack and leak campaign. So the trolling campaign was mostly by private organizations. The hack and leak was by the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. That was the campaign to break into a variety of email accounts and then use the output of that to try to influence the US media. The third was direct attacks against election infrastructure. And the fourth was what we sometimes call white propaganda, like obvious propaganda, or RT Sputnik, effectively messages push out by organizations that are known to be aligned with the Russian state. So from our perspective, Facebook, we had a little bit of knowledge of the GRU campaign. So to step back a little bit, all of the major tech companies have intelligence teams whose job it is to study the misuse of their platforms by governments. And those intelligence teams are generally staffed with people that come from law enforcement and the intelligence community from Western nations, right? So for my team was mostly people from NSA, FBI. I think we had a GCHQ person kind of come through, a number of other people like that. And then people from private companies who have worked on responding to traditional cyber threats. We had a very good relationship with the FBI, and via the FBI, other elements of the intelligence community who work on cyber threat. But that relationship was really focused on traditional threats. People using Facebook to plant malware on computers at the State Department. That's like a real campaign that we uncovered and told the State Department about. Trying to spearfish the accounts of people in the Air Force, trying to take over people's Facebook accounts to find democracy activists in Hong Kong, right? Those are kind of traditional cyber threats. APT 2829, that's GRU SVR, the Ministry of State Security in China, People's Liberation Army. What we didn't have inside the companies, and did not seem to exist inside the government either, were people whose job it was to specifically study propaganda actors who had no offensive cyber component. And so from our perspective, we saw a little bit of interesting information around the Hack and Leak campaign. The attacks didn't happen on Facebook. They actually happened on somebody else's platform, rhymes with Schmoogle. And so we tipped off the FBI to what we knew. We now know the FBI didn't do much with all the information they knew about that. But we were not looking for kind of the organized propaganda stuff until after the election, at which point we were not getting any help from the government, but we went and we found a bunch of the stuff and then released it kind of famously in summer of 2017 when everybody proceeded to lose their minds about it. And so one of the things we try to talk about in the report is, these seem like all these different problems, right? The hacks against election infrastructure, manipulating the media with leaked information, doing, memes and image trolling on Facebook. To our adversaries, they're not different problems for different organizations. They are one consistent set of influence operations against one target. And so one of the things we're trying to do is make recommendations for all of the different people involved, which is effectively the government, the social media companies, and the general media. Because if we don't act in a concerted way, just like we didn't in 2016, we will see the same kind of problems.
Great, and so maybe, Nate, I can take you back a little bit too to the last election. We did some interesting work together regarding the platforms and advertising, and this was before the 2016 election. Maybe you could just say a little bit about the regulatory regime related to social media as it has existed, as it's changing, knowing that much more thought and law and regulation has been put on traditional media, right? Broadcast media, radio, print, other things, and not so much here. So the platforms really, I wouldn't say they were at sea, but they had much more ability to either regulate these things themselves, or they weren't aware, or they weren't doing things. So what was the landscape like before the last election in the regulation of social media?
I should say that landscape has remained, so that it's not like we've had new legislation on advertising or campaign finance since the 2016 election. But you're right, which is that most of the campaign finance and ad regulatory system is predicated on television being the main mode of political communication. I actually wrote an article about 6 years ago that, I think that we talked about here at BPC back then, called "The Campaign Revolution Will Not Be Televised," and it was all about how once you move to the internet, sort of our theory of campaign finance changes quite considerably. A lot of the notions that we had about sort of push versus pull technology and how that has an impact on people's voter decision making, as well as the First Amendment law on this, really do depend on the technology. But in general, the internet is the Wild West of campaign finance, right? With a few exceptions, it's not regulated terrain. If you put an ad on another person's website with messages of express advocacy, that is to say, endorsements for and against a candidate, then you have to disclose. But and you have to have some disclaimers. But for the most part, there's sort of huge gaping holes in the campaign finance system when it comes to the internet. That being said, it's also critical to understand that most of the Russian spending in 2016 was perfectly legal. And 80% of the ads that the Russians ran did not mention a candidate, right? They were on divisive political issues like Black Lives Matter, guns, immigration, and the like. In many ways, they were just mimicking what was already happening in the domestic ecosystem. And so those types of advertisements would still be legal today. What has changed since 2016 is that the platforms have now adopted much more rigorous disclosure regimes. They still have a long way to go, and we talk about that in the report. But Google and Facebook and Twitter have developed these ad transparency products, right, so that you can now see all of the people and institutions that are advertising on their platforms during an election.
And I guess this leads me to what I was going to ask you is just the things that the platforms have been doing, what's been helpful. I mean, they've been asking people to identify themselves more. They've been collecting ads. They've been doing some things related to transparency. What are the key things that you think they've done? And then let's get into what other threats are out there and what needs to be done.
So first, we have to be careful not to overemphasize political advertising as a component here, right? So overall, the initial group of political ads we found was about 100,000. I think if you add $100,000,
which compares to
like hundreds of millions from the campaigns.
I mean, this is the thing. You know, if the Russians are able to sway a U.S. election with $100,000 worth of ads, whether it's purchased in rubles or not, then a lot of the political consultants in this room and outside on K Street have been wasting time for a lot of the last 20 years. So,
The goal of the political ads for the Russians was to build audiences was basically to cut the corner. Instead of spending a year or two building up organically audiences on Facebook, they wanted to be able to bootstrap that by putting their message in front of people who might be open to it. So it is something that needs to be controlled, but we have to be careful not to. It's kind of a DC obsession that we were a little bit surprised in Silicon Valley about how much people flipped out about political ads. And I understand why, because it is something that's actually regulated here. Although, again, like Nate said, the vast majority of political ads on Facebook were not illegal for the Russians to run. It is not illegal for a Russian citizen to run a pro-Black Lives Matter ad on Facebook, right? And so, but people lost their minds here, and so like the companies have to do a lot. But unfortunately, I think the company's focus on that is somewhat based upon the political environment in DC, and therefore distracts from the overall bigger issue problem, which is the creation of fake personas that allow them to push their messages. And so important things have happened on political ads. You're required to demonstrate citizenship before running it in a number of countries. There is transparency. We do call for significantly more transparency, especially via the API. No, now that I'm on the outside, I'd like to have access to this data still for our team to study these issues, and we need to get that data access. They've built up teams whose entire job is to look for and stop this kind of behavior. And so that is probably the biggest hidden thing, is that effectively every couple weeks now, there's a Facebook blog post on we shut down another organization. This is where I want to pivot a little bit away from Russia, in that the other problem with the DC conversation on this is that it's all Russia all the time. I think partially because of the political issue with a guy who owns a hotel here, apparently. But the Russian playbook is out there, right? And there's a long history in the cyber conflict, cyber war space of one of the big countries, the US, Israel, China, France, like UK, like a big, powerful country will do something, prove that there is a type of attack that is effective, and then that will be picked up by all the smaller countries, and then possibly even private groups. And so the Russians, just like the US and Israel demonstrated with Stuxnet, the effectiveness of using malware to go after air-gapped IoT, or the Chinese demonstrated in the 2000s how to break into the Windows network of a defense contractor. The Russians have demonstrated a pretty good playbook for influencing a democracy. And so if you look at like the Facebook announcements, you'll see now they're announcing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps using the exact same techniques. They're talking about potentially Chinese-aligned groups doing it. And so we got to broaden the conversation a little bit, and that's also why we're hoping to have some bipartisan support for this stuff. Because if you look at the set of adversaries beyond just Russia, clearly there will be the goal of targeting both major political parties in the US.
And so you're putting ads as something that happened, but not at the highest level. What are the threats that you are most concerned about going forward? I mean, the copycat aspect of it, but in what areas?
So ads need to be controlled. Sure. Ads are important. From my perspective, you have to actually decompose these products into the different sub-products based upon how much amplification they give you. And advertising is an interesting component of most of these products. in that it allows you to amplify your voice limited only by the amount of money you have, and it also allows you to put content in front of people who did not choose to see it, right? There's a lot of other discussion about stuff that happens online that people don't like. That is the express decision of individuals to consume content that is perhaps not agreeable to everybody, but they are making that decision, where advertising puts content in front of people who did not ask to see it. And so we think political ads need to be controlled for that way. We think they need to be controlled just for domestic purposes. That we're, to wind the clock back, the first interesting election for Facebook, like influencing a US election, is not 2016, it's almost certainly 2012, where the Obama team completely outclassed the RNC and Romney teams in their online advertising, using a number of techniques that are actually not that different than what people got mad about with Cambridge Analytica. But a number of people were happier with the outcome, so there was less discussion of it. But we're ending up in this arms race where everybody's billionaires are gunning up to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build massive data operations. And so we call for legislation that restricts that issue as well, that reduces the hyper-targeting of political ads, because we don't want elections to be decided just by whose billionaires have the best nerds, effectively. But then on the other stuff, on the political stuff, the other thing the companies need to really be thinking about is what kind of transparency they provide on organic, non-paid political content. And that is an easier question for Facebook than it is for some other platforms, because Facebook already has an authentic identity policy. And they've been moving in a direction where they pierce the identity shield behind which a number of these people operate. That is a much bigger issue on Twitter and YouTube, where they have no such policy. And so you could just say, I am the whatever group, without any kind of responsibility for authenticating yourself. And so I think that's going to be a critical issue. Now, anonymous pamphleteering is a critical part of American history, right? And so we have to be careful how much we crack down on it. But that is the mechanism by which that effectively you can release an anonymous pamphlet in the United States remotely from 6,000 miles away without your fingerprints on it. That is the kind of thing that we need to look from a product perspective that the companies need to think about more.
And if we want to pivot here to talking about domestic campaign finance and how essentially social media, internet advertising, communications is not really regulated in the same way. What you're, I think, hopeful that a more regulatory regime will be extended to areas that are now in broadcast. What's your vision of where you want to be on there?
Well, as you know, since we through the Bipartisan Policy Center, we, along with Bob Bauer, Ben Ginsberg, issued a report with a whole coalition of political scientists on sort of a description of the campaign finance problem, or the dynamics of campaign finance post-2016. And in general, right, we talk about the rise of the internet as being, what's going to replace almost television over the long term. There's still a considerable amount of television advertising. We should expect that going forward. But the internet enables certain types of communication that you can't really do through broadcast and cable media, the targeting being the critical feature there. We sort of look at and endorse portions of the Honest Ads Act, which has been put forward in Congress. There are certain, for the most part, the Honest Ads Act takes the regulations that apply to television and applies it online. There are some problems in doing that. A lot of it has to do with how audiences are developed online. So, for example, the assumption that's built into the Honest Ads Act is that you'd have disclosure of targeting information like, white women in suburbia over the age of 30, right, get this ad. Now that's the way a lot of people do targeting, but what's been happening recently is that the campaigns develop these ad lists and email lists, and they turn them over either to social media companies or to another vendor, and then that actually becomes the basis for the communication. So this hyper-targeting is really something that's new in the internet age. It's something, I should say, that there's some analogs in direct mail and some other communication, as well as the way that AI and machine learning interact with advertising, which is something that I don't think the Honest Ads Act pays attention to. But nevertheless, we do argue for more disclosure in the online environment. We think that's an important step, particularly get at this this problem of foreign intervention. Now, one thing that's interesting about both the Russian intervention and then the legislative responses to it is that most of the, as we said before, most of the Russian ads were not about candidates, right? They were about issues. And so the classic division in American campaign finance law between issue advocacy and express advocacy has now come full force sort of in this conflict about Russian intervention. So the platforms have actually adopted different rules for issue advocacy. So you actually have Facebook requiring disclosure not just for candidate ads, but also for issue ads. So what they call issues of national legislative importance, parroting what you have in the Honest Ads Act. And so now we have a private company, right, deciding what a political issue is. Right? And they developed 20 different issues. One of them was values, you know, kind of a capacious definition. It's one of the reasons that Zuckerberg has asked for government regulation in this area, because they don't want to be in that business. It's also one of the differences between Facebook and Google, whereas Google doesn't require disclosure for political ads. Google does require disclosure of targeting, whereas Facebook requires disclosure of exposure, like who received the ad. And so we have this mess of regulations that are imposed by the companies, and we need some uniformity imposed by government.
So let me ask you, I mean, I don't want to focus only on ads. I think Alex's caution is correct, but maybe this is leads us into other areas as well. I mean, the broad revolution in social media and the internet is the sort of flexibility and the way in which there are many, many avenues of communication. So yes, in the broadcast world, there are some options for you, but we've kind of come to a certain product that you can buy. You can buy a certain number of points of advertising. People start to understand what that means. It's uniform. What is an ad in the digital media world is a very good question. One, about the issues, but two, just about the form of it. Yeah. Sure, there's a video. We understand that. That looks kind of like a TV ad, or maybe there's a banner ad. But when you get into targeting, or what if we're doing an email campaign, or a set of messages, or pushing things up people's feeds in certain ways, all those things are not only hard to describe, hard to regulate, but one can imagine easily moved around, right? So campaigns are creative, and the platforms are creative. Do you think a regulatory world can easily adapt to that, or are there some areas you just think we should be, but we're going to have to accept that there's a kind of fluidity to this world? And that's
the story of campaign finance regulation generally, right? Which is that you push one side of the balloon and then it pops out elsewhere. But I mean, the Wild West that is the internet when it comes to campaign advertising is going to be the whole system soon enough, right? I mean, because even what we talk about, what is a television ad, it's like your television is just one of the many screens in your house right now, right? It's not different from your phone or your computer or your tablet, right? Eventually, all of these things are merging together, and so how to figure out how to even deal with that environment seems to me to be a high priority. Maybe the answer is fine that we should be more libertarian about this, but let's harmonize the rules across these different surfaces. But you're right, which is that we're talking about all types of communication, and you mentioned boosted posts, right? Which is the ability of someone not just to pay for an actual ad, right, but to boost their social media, communication in someone else's feed. This is where I should say that the media companies have actually gotten roped into the Facebook ad transparency regime. They've made some changes recently, but when they required that there be any political communication on Facebook that was paid, right, by an outside entity, that meant the New York Times and others, right, were considered to be paying for political advertising, because if they boost their posts, or if Amazon boosts a post on a book that's like the Russia hoax or something like that, or for that matter, if there's a Colin Kaepernick ad that Nike has, on these platforms, all of that is going to get roped into the political ad transparency regime.
Well, so you mentioned one of the thorny issues that you bring up in your report. That is, what about media exception? Yeah. So, I was in my cab here listening to Radio Sputnik. No, I actually wasn't, but you could easily do that. You can find RT in your hotel rooms and other places around the world. And of course, we're talking, that's Russia. Of course, you can find the BBC, and you can find, France 24, and all sorts of things that are sponsored by other governments or by private entities in other countries. What do we do about those? There are some of them are being used literally, or they're agents of foreign influence, but some of them might be more loosely, and we have a great tradition of protecting the press in many ways from these regulations. What's your thinking on this?
Well, so this is something that I think has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I mean, we spend so much time trying to look under the rock to see what has not been transparent and what secret measures have been taken, but hiding in plain sight were these Russian broadcasting entities that had presences not just on the airwaves but also online, and these are significant audiences that they're able to reach. In fact, most of what they do also is completely true. Right? I mean, well over 90% of the stories that RT and Sputnik run are true. Actually, we have in the audience Renee DiResta, who's going to be has joined us at the Cyber Policy Center. She remarked once that a lot of what RT is engaged in is so-called disaster porn, right? Which is this kind of sort of, man eaten by alligator in Orlando, right? That they build audiences that way, and then at the time of the election, then they inject political coverage, right? And so much, and they pose really difficult problems for regulation and for the First Amendment, because how do you distinguish, as you were saying, from RT between RT and BBC and CBC and any of these other foreign broadcasters? Fortunately, when it comes to RT and Sputnik, we have this phenomenon, or actual regulation that occurred where they were designated foreign agents after the 2016 election, right? And so that was a pretty significant thing for the government to do, to designate a foreign media organization as a foreign agent. And so having some kind of disclosure, both on broadcast and online, that designates them as foreign agents, I think does not sound, too far a stretch. But what happens when you have the kind of offshoots of these organizations? It's going to pose a really difficult challenge. YouTube, so the firms, the platforms have adapted to this environment. YouTube now, even when it comes to the BBC, puts a disclaimer at the bottom of the video that says the BBC is funded and funded in whole or in part by the British government, right? And they have similar things for other countries as well. But this is something that we really need to think about, because you look at RT's YouTube presence, was in the hundreds of millions of views, if not billions, if not a billion, and they, but partly because they have worldwide coverage and they're participating in democratic influence campaigns around the world.
So I think each of these issues has a direction people want to go in, and some worries about some of the unintended consequences. And maybe I could just broadly come back to sort of disinformation. That's a broad term, but the platforms are struggling with the idea of what to do about content that is false or inflammatory or somehow crosses bounds. And sometimes that's communication amongst citizens. Sometimes it's got some foreign influence in this. What do you think the platforms are doing effectively to get at these issues? And then I guess the corollary question is, there are people who are worried that perhaps they're going too far, that they're favoring one party over the other, that more right-leaning people are being limited or banned on these platforms. So what are the platforms? What should they be doing? Is there a role for government regulation? And what about the criticisms?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the problems.
Small question.
Yeah.
Well, let's start talking maybe a little bit about what you did while you were there at Facebook, particularly on disinformation. That might be useful for people.
Right. So the Facebook issue is a little bit different. And then, like I said, Facebook has an authenticity policy that allowed us after the 2016 election, when we were looking at the fake news issue, we started to tease apart what was causing quote-unquote fake news. So first off, the term fake news was never that useful. It certainly is not useful now, where it means something I don't agree with, right? But if you're just talking about news stories with completely made-up facts, the vast majority of that ecosystem is powered by people who are economically motivated, who are trying to take advantage of people's preconceived political notions to get them to click on clickbait. They have the same economic model as the New York Times. It's just a lot cheaper to not pay journalists and just make stuff up, right? Like if you're all profit and very little loss, then it's actually a much more profitable business than like a newspaper that actually pays for journalism. And so they are mostly financially motivated. A number of the people behind it also seem to have some kind of ideological motivation. And only a tiny fraction of the overall volume has anything to do with any kind of foreign influence, right? And so when we deal with these issues, you are mostly talking about a domestic problem, or a domestic problem that is also powered by outsourced labor in places like Pakistan and Romania, where they're paying people to create the content in content farms. So it does make it hard. And one of the key things at Facebook we were trying to do was to pivot off of the authenticity policies, which allow you to say, okay, well, you're lying about who you are. Therefore, we can take you down without any kind of knowledge of the content. That's the easy mode. The harder is when you now get...
A fair amount of that's been done.
A fair amount of that's been done. Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is being done in an automated fashion. So coming out of our initial investigation after the 2016 election, we built a fake account detector, basically a machine learning algorithm that you could train it on what fake accounts look like. And then that detector is now shutting down something like 2 billion accounts per quarter, right? So it's very busy, right? And that has significantly reduced some of that issue of the fly-by-night, create a bunch of accounts, spam a bunch of fake news. The harder issue that the companies are dealing with now is people who are who they say they are, who are saying things that perhaps they don't actually believe. So it is not what we would classify as disinformation. Disinformation is information that you are intentionally spreading maliciously, knowing that's incorrect. Anti-vaxxers believe it, right? Now, I don't like anti-vaxxers, no offense to people in the room. I have 3 kids who go to school in the Bay Area. The fact that one of my kids might come home with a disease that's like featured in Little House on the Prairie, I think is ridiculous in the 21st century. But part of living in a free society is putting up with other people's stupidity, right? And we have like a law in California that you have to vaccinate your kids. And we often in society regulate the actual action, but then allow people to speak freely about whether they agree or not with that regulation. And that is what a lot of anti-vax conversation is. And that is a much harder place for the companies to be because they have always not wanted to be ministries of truth, where they don't want to have to determine whether something is true or not. And they don't want to have to completely squash speech that people are intentionally being part of. And so I think this is where I usually pivot back to that idea of for the parts of the product, the features that have the most amplification, the company should have the most editorial responsibility. So cutting anti-vaxxers off from advertising, I think totally fine. Advertising is like a complete editorial responsibility. Reducing the ability for them to spread their message through pushing it over and over again, perhaps, but then allowing people to have things like private groups, I think is the appropriate place to be on a number of different kind of edgy pieces of political speech. And the companies are trying that, but they're trying to do that at the backdrop of a media. We're honestly in a media moral panic right now about the internet, one that is not unlike the ones that you see about the printing press and radio and television about any change in the media environment. It's partially driven by the business model concerns of the traditional media, who no longer have that gatekeeper capability that gave them an oligopoly on advertising. And so there's a lot of difficult things going into it. But in the backdrop of that media environment, I think the companies are being pushed to make decisions that they shouldn't make. And I actually wish they were a little more aggressive about that. And one of the key things they need to do is they need to explain why they make any one decision. There was this big back and forth with YouTube last week. And I don't want to go into all the details. I actually think it was fine for YouTube to demonetize this channel. Them paying somebody money gives them a lot more editorial responsibility than just carrying the content. But they explained it like in 3 tweets, right? And what they really should have had is like a 5-page, something that reads like a legal decision from a judge of, this is our standard, these are our tests of whether you're failing the standard, this is how this content fails our tests, these are the precedents we are creating for future decisions. And that is one of the core problems, is that the companies are making these decisions based upon who is loudest and beating them up the most. And you know, if you demonstrate that, if the refs demonstrate that they will blow a whistle when somebody flops, then you end up with an Italian soccer league. Everybody's flopping continuously, right? And that is what has happened to our political sphere, is because YouTube and Facebook have reacted to political pressure. Now everybody is going to continuously put pressure on for them to silence their political enemies from both sides. And it is happening on both sides. I do want to push back. Like, conservatives are the most loud about it. I do not think there is I don't think there's actually a theme of anti-conservative decisions here. I think unfortunately, a lot of like the really low quality media outlets have been targeting people on the right. That has actually changed a lot since 2016, and that there's a lot of kind of the low quality fake news stuff is from the resistance side, right? And so it is more bipartisan now, but in the run up to 2016, the people who were doing it economically, they were making more money by targeting kind of the right ecosystem than they were on the left. So I do think there has been some disproportionate outcome, but like when I saw people make these decisions, they were trying to be incredibly fastidious about making them in a content neutral way and applying the rules, but they have to describe how that they're doing that publicly so other people have some confidence.
So I know we often say, and I think it's true, that across the political spectrum, there's more interest potentially in regulating the platforms, and there's some thought that the platforms wouldn't mind some regulation in some areas. Is this one of these areas? This is a thorny area. Sometimes I think that it's a bigger talk than once you get into the details. Are we likely to want to see platforms want government regulation when it comes to questions of truth and things going across the line, hate speech, things that are traditional government categories in free speech? Are we going to see movement in that area?
To some extent, we have the worst of all worlds, which is that government is unwilling to regulate it, certainly in the U.S., because they know it's unconstitutional, yet they expect Facebook and Google to make the same kinds of decisions that they wouldn't trust government in making, right? And so whether it's hate speech or disinformation, that would be a total third rail from First Amendment law standpoint, right, for government to regulate. Now, the Europeans and other governments don't have similar obstacles in their way, right? So you have the NetzDG law in Germany, which basically says that all the illegal hate speech that's sanctioned by law can Google and Facebook and other platforms have to take it down within 48 hours of being notified by it. Now, that puts Google and Facebook in this incredible position that they have to essentially adjudicate, right, whether something is actually illegal or not under existing law. But that law, as well as efforts both in Britain and the EU generally, is now being replicated around the world. And Alex can talk about all the different legal regimes he had to deal with at Facebook. But, you know, Facebook has to make these very difficult decisions on a daily basis. In Thailand, for example, they make it illegal to insult the king, right? Facebook has complied with that so that when the Thai government says that you have to take down insults to the king, they do so. There's all kinds of hate speech rules that you see in different European democracies. Obviously, Holocaust denial is illegal in certain jurisdictions. But at times, they've stood up to the government so that when Vietnam asked them to take down the page of a California civil rights organization because it thought that it was a terrorist organization, they say no. Right? It's a very, very difficult decisions that they have to make. I think from the standpoint of the platforms, at least when it comes to regulation by European and U.S. democracy, I think their view is, look, you make the hard decisions. It's like, if you think it's so easy to regulate hate speech, then you should try and do it. And so you have this funny situation in Britain, right, where they have this parliamentary report on online harms, which talks about the taking down of illegal content, but also urging the platforms to take down harmful but not illegal content. And the question is, well, if you think it's so harmful, government, why are you unwilling to regulate? And the answer is going to be, well, because the collateral free speech damage, right? And we shouldn't expect that Facebook and Google are in a better position to police those boundaries than the governments are.
I'll be a little more frank. There's a lot of cowardice in governments right now where they want to control people's speech, but they don't want their fingerprints on it. The Germans, to their credit, at least define what is hate speech, right? Like, they're pushing the adjudication of that out of the German court system into secret rooms in Facebook. And so you can argue from a procedural ground, but at least they are operating off of a whole set of German precedent about what is and is not allowed in Germany. The UK harms paper, the law in the the law in Australia, do not define what is bad. They just basically say, take down the bad stuff, and if you don't take down the stuff we think is bad, we will punish you. If you force somebody to do it, it is not voluntary anymore, right? And so one, you can't say, we're going to force people to have voluntary standards, right? Like, if a government requires you to have standards, it is now government action. And if you're going to make these decisions, they should be made in an open and democratic process. One, because we should be making these decisions as a democracy. We should not be outsourcing to half-trillion to trillion-dollar companies to decide what is acceptable political speech in all of our democracies. But the other issue is the contagion issue, which Nate talked about a bit, which is the NetzDG law in Germany has already been copied effectively by places like Turkey and Vietnam. And so we have to be, if a Western government is going to say, we want you to censor more, they should then make the decisions in an open way, because the most dangerous model is allowing autocratic countries to have the same power to say, you know what we mean, wink, wink. Do what we want or we will punish you, in the same way you're doing for the Australians or for the UK. But there will be no public discussion, and we can keep our hands clean of your over-censorship of our political opponents, which is extremely dangerous direction to go. And there's our colleague at Stanford, Daphne Keller, is one of the world's experts in what's called intermediate liability, which is the legal regimes around these platforms. And she uses the term irrational exuberance for censorship, that there's this kind of this idea that the world is so different now with these platforms that we should overturn all of our beliefs as Americans or in the West about what is acceptable and not acceptable political censorship, and that things are not actually that different. And so that there's this irrational exuberance that you can enforce via AI political speech norms without dealing with the downsides. And I'm going to tell you, there's lots of downsides. The truth is the companies are bad at doing this. If they censor hate speech, then they will also censor people who are complaining about hate speech, right? If they're going to censor, if they're going to try to stop people from being pro violence in Syria, then they will also take down the videos of people who are reporting on violence in Syria. It is extremely, extremely difficult to make those kind of fine-grained decisions at scale. And so encouraging the companies to make them at scale without any kind of democratic component, I think is a huge mistake.
So let me switch to a couple other topics that you covered in your report. One is, and maybe you might argue was perhaps the most consequential in the last election, campaigns and security or other actors. People broke into John Podesta's emails and used that information as a kind of way to embarrass the Clinton campaign. Obviously, other things can happen. And I don't want to limit it to just campaigns. I don't want to limit it to just parties. You think about all of the actors we have in politics, which are not centralized, from vendors to consultants. What do we do about this? So, and what, how hopeful are you?
Well, so that is a super hard problem.
Yep.
Because one, like you said, there are 10,000 people here who live in Washington, many of whom used to be in the government and therefore protected under the shield of professional IT people and professional security people, and now they're just grandparents, right? So John Podesta went from like White House Executive Office of the President protecting his email to like him doing his own Gmail security. And so, people are getting a little more paranoid now. The companies are trying to do things to proactively identify these people and to secure them. But the truth is we will never get past the point at which SVR, GRU, Ministry of State Security from PRC, PLA, PRC, People's Liberation Army, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the North Korean Lazarus Group, for adversaries of that level, they will always now be able to get, from now on, they will always be able to read the email of politically important people in DC. We will not be able to stop that. We can marginally reduce that and make it so it's like not the entire DNC server, right? But we're never going to get past the point of them having something. And so part of it is, one of the things that we're trying to address in this report is there's been a lot of criticism of government. There's been a lot of criticism of tech companies. That criticism is correct in both of those. There's been very little criticism of the media. And the truth is that the mainstream media is, of all the organizations, one of the ones that is most responsible for amplifying Russian themes in 2016, in that they allowed the Podesta leaks and the framing of a slight number of emails from the DNC servers to change their entire coverage of the race. And so we have recommendations around the media looking at itself and examining itself in the same way that honestly the government and the tech companies have, and then publishing what their standards are going to be going forward. And it's very hard because we are totally cool with people writing stories about leaked emails, right? It's like, it's how a lot of our free press works, and we don't want to make that illegal. And as a free society, we want that kind of to exist, but we also don't want people to get played. And so we need responsible journalistic organizations to build their own standards of how do they report on newsworthy leaks without getting played. Maybe that means verifying every single thing before you publish it. So Politico ran a live blog, I'm not kidding, a live blog of the Podesta leaks, where they're like, going through it like children going through garbage and like, oh man, look at this embarrassing thing, look at this embarrassing thing. Like that cannot be journalistically appropriate, right? Like you have to verify what it is. You need to put these stories out in the overall context and not then over amplify it. Like maybe you cover a story, but then you don't cover it 24/7 on cable news, the Debbie Wasserman Schultz stuff, right? And so I think that's one of the areas, because honestly, we're not going to get away from stuff getting hacked. We're just going to end up with that becoming maybe a little bit harder, but the key thing is going to be, as a society, can we resist being manipulated that way? And to their credit, the French actually did a good job in this. There was a similar attempt by the GRU to poison the political discussion right before their media deadline, so they have a blackout period. And so like 12 hours before the blackout period started, GRU dumped all this stuff. They called Macron leaks. And the French media was like, we have 12 hours, we're not going to report it, right? They collectively decided we're not going to just, and that was smart, because in that case, GRU had planted documents that had been completely invented alongside actual real emails. And so if they had just reported it out, then they would have been reporting out incorrect information. And so the question is, can we have that kind of self-control in the US media?
And so you're talking about something, yeah,
obviously we're not naive in thinking that it's like you can prevent this kind of coverage. But the data on when these stories actually reach levels of virality is when the legacy reputable media organizations actually cover them. And so of course it's going to be out there on the internet, right? But whether you're talking about Pizzagate or you're talking about the Nancy Pelosi video or other things, a lot of the uptick happens once the kind of established media organizations take a bite out of them, right? And we have to recognize that. And look, in this competitive media environment, we know the pressures that are there. We're not naive about this. And we know talking about norms and changing norms is not as attractive as talking about hard statutes and the like. But it is something that has to be looked at, in part because, as Alex said, like, we have beaten up on Facebook and Google quite a bit, and we should continue beating up on them. But
we have whole chapters beating up on them. Really, lots of beating in here, if you're looking for it.
There's a lot of self-flagellation by Alex. But
Alex's personal screw-ups, chapter 6. It's a big chapter. It's significant.
But we need to sort of expand the lens there a little bit so that we look at all actors in the disinformation wars.
Well, a great example of the amplification is the Christchurch video, right? That one of the things that drove the re-uploads of this video is that the media was continuously saying to people, there's a video. It's horrible. You're not allowed to see it. We're allowed to see it because we're the good guys. But you, the unwashed public, are not allowed to see this video. It's up on Facebook. Don't search for it on Facebook, right? And so that drove a massive vacuum pressure of interest in this content. And then there's tens of thousands of kind of ideological fellow travelers of that murderer who are willing to re-upload the video. And so that's how you end up in a situation of 1.5 million uploads in 24 hours. And so I think the media loves to pretend that they are separate, that they get to say whatever they want, and that they have this magic protection, that they are not morally responsible for their play in it. But when they are part of this cycle, they have to take responsibility for their part too, not just criticize the other parts of it.
And just to follow up one more with Nate on specifically on the issue of stolen information, stolen emails, right. Hacked things. You call for some self-restraint, but also potentially some regulation in this area. What's I mean, some people would say, well, what's the difference between the New York Times and WikiLeaks, right? They're both getting information that's not supposed to be given out. That's in a way the core part of their business. Is there something regulatory to be done in this, or are we calling for more restraint on the part of actors?
No, I mean, so there are First Amendment cases directly on point there where when it comes to sort of stolen information of public interest that you are do have a First Amendment right to put it out there. As Alex said, that's not uniform around the world. There are a lot of other places that deal with this differently. And so we're talking about norm creation. As Alex said, part of so here's something that the media organizations can do, which is to announce what their policies are. Think about it during calm times as opposed to during the heat of the moment, and then stick to it. Right? I mean, if the answer is that you will report on any hacked email from either one of the campaigns, okay, then we know that those are the rules. We're also, calling for, as has happened with some of the candidates already, that the candidates should also abide by the rule that they're not going to use information from their opponents, right? And part of a lot of the story, of course, with the Russian intervention is the calling forth by one candidate, to find the emails of his opponent. So I'll let you guess who that might have been. And so, that's the kind of thing that we should have sort of treaties between the candidates on that type of thing as well.
The other standard that I think the media needs to really consider for 2020 is what their attribution standards are going to be to call something a foreign influence campaign. So you now have social media monitoring groups that work for all the political parties, all the campaigns, all of the PACs. They are going to continuously say that anything bad from the other side is actually a foreign campaign, right? There is no downside to saying it's the Russians, and so the vast majority of it is just going to be domestic actors, right? Like we screw ourselves way more than the Russians screw us, to be completely honest, in our information environment. And so, like the media, I'm giving these talks, like inside of our intelligence team at Facebook, which again had all these people from the US government, we tried to adapt an attribution model where we said these are the things we require for attribution. This is what low, medium, and high confidence means in these different models. Media organizations need to do the same thing before they amplify some partisan saying that's the Russians, that's the Russians, that's the Russians, which in the long run also kind of benefits the Russians. There's a reason why they don't cover this stuff up, right? Like Russia's a failing petrochemical state with half the GDP of California, and that has to keep on raising their retirement age, their social security age, right? Like they've got a lot of domestic problems, and the fact that Putin is portrayed as standing astride the world with all the Western democracies, being played by him as the puppeteer is good for him, right? That is a message he wants to put out. It's the reason why instead of secretly killing somebody by running them over with a car, they use nerve agents or they use $10 million in polonium, right? Like they're leaving their signature on this stuff, just like with social media. And so us giving them credit for all the stuff they haven't earned is not good for us and is not good for them. And that is something we're just going to all have to be like a lot more restrained about calling anything a influence operation when most likely it's just kind of a fake news person or somebody breaking the rules a little bit on Twitter.
Can I also say one other thing, and this is a larger point about disinformation generally in the U.S., and this actually only applies to the U.S. There's some other stuff that's happening outside the U.S. that's worth noting, which is that for most people on Facebook, actually false information, right, is a tiny share of what they're being exposed to. Really insignificant, right? The average person has 200 stories in their newsfeed. By any generous estimate, 3 to 5% of that is something we might call news, okay? We should not think that the folks in this room have typical news feeds, right? It's not, and journalists tend to think, right, this must be a huge problem because look at how much news I have in my news feed, right? And so 3 to 5% is anything we would call news. Even thinking generously, maybe 1 out of 200 stories is going to be actually false, right? And so if you think about that, that's going to be, every few days that the average person is seeing this. Now, we moved in the sort of study of disinformation away from what the average person is seeing to thinking about, well, there are some populations for whom it's actually a large share. Okay, the most recent studies on this suggest it's old people. Okay, and that so if you're thinking about digital literacy in high schools, that's not going to solve this problem.
Older than anybody here.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
And so that the disproportionate share of the forwarding and consumption of disinformation, truly false stuff, is happening on a small slice of the population. That's important because it is also quite clear that what's happened because of the currency of the notion of fake news is that we are now, what's happened is because of the overreaction, people are losing confidence in true news more than they are becoming better able to detect false news. And so while it is true that now people are more suspicious of stuff that looks suspicious on platforms, they're also more suspicious of legacy media and true news as well. And that is really the Russian victory here, right? Which is to sow the seeds of doubt, not just over things that should be doubted, but also among everything as well. And it's obviously because as Alex said, the term fake news is being lodged against our political opponents, right, or on media organizations that we don't like. It is only applicable really to a small share of the news that you see online. And probably for just a small share of the population.
So you and I worked together on issues of election administration with the President's Commission on Election Administration, Bob Auer, Ben Ginsberg. we have some threats to our voting systems. Now, I think we should define those carefully, so maybe you could lay out. We certainly heard about and know about some activities that were meant to influence, to penetrate aspects of our voting technology. Maybe lay out a little bit of what we know was done, what areas perhaps we'd be worried about, but didn't really get the play that some people are saying.
Actually, it's good to take us back to that point. So the Presidential Commission on Election Administration report, which was, I think, the last bipartisan sort of election report that has had some play, focused on, it was originally sort of thought of as the Lines Commission to deal with like long lines on election day, but it ended up dealing with all kinds of other issues, including voting technology. There are two things that came out of that report that are now, I think, relevant to this discussion. The first is we did not in that report, well, we worried about the functionality of voting machines. We were worried that, you know, most of these electronic voting machines that have been bought after the Help America Vote Act was passed were reaching the end of their natural life, so that they were both insecure, but also they were breaking down, you know, where you had election administrators going on eBay to try to find parts for their Windows NT-driven systems. So that was what we focused on. We didn't, in that report, by the way, call for, say, voter-verified paper audit trails, right? And I was at least of the view that that was not as significant a thing as people thought at the time. In this report, we do switch course. I think at this point, because we know we have a foreign adversary who is interested in probing these systems, the need for a voter-verified paper audit trail is quite important. And you even see ES&S, one of the major voting machine manufacturers, this week calling for that as a national standard as well.
After threatening to sue security research for years.
Well,
it's a little bit of a. So, let's not give them too much credit.
Well, find hope where you can.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's an example of something. Another thing we recommended in that report was online voter registration. And I think it's still a good thing to have online voter registration. But we also know that if you had to find the area where the Russians probed the most in the 2016 election, it was in the voter registration systems that are, you know, on the internet, right? And so we need to start thinking about that from a cybersecurity standpoint. But what's critical is that we start thinking about auditing every aspect of the election infrastructure from the from the process of voter registration through the companies that are developing the voting machines, because we know that some of their emails were phished and the like, through the electronic poll books, right, which is another thing we recommended in that commission report, where we know that the Russians showed interest in probing those systems, as well as, of course, the voting machines themselves and the counting mechanisms, right? All of those have now become computerized. They're all susceptible to hacking, and we need to make sure that we develop some kind of security capability there, and it requires a national response, right? We need, we have a nation that's coming after our elections. We need a nation that will respond to it, so that you cannot have, the election administrators of Miami-Dade or Cuyahoga County going up against the GRU, because, as Alex said, they're always going to be outclassed by them. We need a concerted response. Someone who was active with that PCA report, as well as others, Matt Masterson, is now at DHS and is doing an incredible job under very difficult circumstances to try to prepare us for 2020. And we do need, greater concerted national effort in this area.
And just to clarify one point, I think you said it, that the core problem of attacks that would actually change votes, that would be a very bad thing, but we don't have evidence that happened.
No,
that's still not a reason to not do things about it. But where we did see some action was in some of the subsidiary systems, especially the voter registration systems, of people looking around. And so when we hear stories about what's going on and what went on, I think we should reassure people that we don't really have any evidence that any votes were changed, right. But there are some issues that we should protect and some other things that are more vulnerable.
But where the kind of social media campaign, disinformation campaign, and the election administration sort of issues intersect is on the sowing of seeds of doubt, right? Because if we, in this environment where we're not trusting sort of our political institutions, it becomes very easy to cast doubt on the security of actual elections, right? And so even if the voting machines are working as intended, if you don't have the kind of auditing and potential paper trail in order to make sure to confirm that everything went as intended, we're now living in an environment where it becomes very easy to cast doubt on the results.
Okay, now I'm going to give you a warning because we want to hear from you. I'm going to ask one last question here. So the mics are going to be coming around, so think about your questions. So I guess to Alex, we've talked about a lot of things. We talked a little bit about what might happen in 2020, but what's on your mind about 2020? What should we really be watching for? What's the key takeaway you want to tell us before we go to the audience questions?
So I think most disinformation is going to become domestic. That's what we learned from the Mexican election, the Indian elections. There's been a lot of, it's funny, I mean, we're so navel-gazing here in the US. We think our problems are very unique to us, but there's a bunch of democratic events that have happened since 2016 that we can learn from. And if you look at those other countries, it is mostly about the same kind of methods being used by domestic actors. So I think we should be looking for that, which, as Nate talks about a lot, is not possibly illegal. Like a lot of stuff that the Russians, if you're, the Mueller indictment of the Russian trolls has a little bit of Capone not paying his taxes flair to it, right? Of like these, but the actual core crime, if done by Americans, if they have a couple of lawyers involved, probably they're okay. And that's a problem. So it's going to be domestic. I think we should look for more of smuggling, if they are a foreign actor, of them smuggling it through legitimate American groups. So something I wasn't able to talk about for a long time, but now it's in a footnote in the Mueller report, so I feel a little better about it, is that if you read the Mueller report very carefully, you'll find that there's a couple of citations of social media being used by the Russian trolls and the GRU in different occasions to reach out to members of the press, reach out to people who are part of legitimate American organizations, and at least one case, reaching out to the family members of somebody who was killed by police officers, right? And so them trying to push these divisiveness in America by supporting people and radicalizing groups and supporting groups that push hard narratives is definitely a possibility that we'll see more of. And we might see more of kind of the point-to-point disinformation. That's what we see a lot of in India, of not one person speaking to hundreds of thousands, but lots of people speaking to dozens. And that is, again, domestic. It is by people recruited by the political parties. And so we could end up in a situation where you have hundreds of thousands of people recruited from our political parties who are pushing some of these messages over and over again, and in some cases in ways that are very hard to trace. So that's what I would be looking for. I'd also be looking, like Nate said, attacks against the certainty of the election. If I was the Russians, I would be involved in the Democratic primary right now. Like, the primary is the interesting thing. I would be trying to build online basis of support for all the candidates. Of 20 candidates, 19 of them have to be losers, right? And so that means that's 19 different populations of people that you can try to convince the system is rigged against them. And so if I was them, I'd be building those relationships right now. Not pushing any pro-Russian propaganda, just pushing stuff on behalf of every single candidate, and then building a population of people who I can turn against whoever the nominee is. And then I would attack the certainty of the election in both directions. If they open up the door a crack, then the lawyers from the DNC and RNC will rip that sucker open with crowbars, right? All they have to do is create a little bit of uncertainty to generate, lots and lots of billable hours in this town.
Okay, so we're going to turn to the audience and wait for the microphone. We'll start right here. If you can identify yourself, and as always, we want questions.
Yeah, I'm not that statement kind of person.
It's more of a statement than a question.
Marian Baksh from Inside Cybersecurity. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about the attacks on infrastructure and what you attribute resistance to policies that might fund better election security, whether that's on the voting rolls or the machines themselves. Do you think it's part of the distraction you were talking about earlier with all the disinformation stuff and an aspect of, people focusing more on that? Or is it something else? Who is opposing this? It seems like paper ballots are pretty non-controversial.
No, they are controversial in some quarters. I mean, partly, so there's a partisan explanation and then there's a federalism explanation for a lot of this. So let's start with the federalism explanation, which is that in general, we push down election administrative authority to the states and to the localities. And in general, that is a good idea, I should say, because, well, let me put it this way. Given the diversity of practices in the United States when it comes to management of the democracy, it's almost impossible along many other dimensions to have national rules. So for example, we in California have ballots that are like book length at this point because of the 100 or so propositions we have to deal with. You know, the West votes by mail, whereas the Southeast votes, you know, much more likely in person.
With the Alaskans and the commission.
Yes. Oh yes, when we traveled to Alaska when the Presidential Commission on Election to talk to what are known as the Alaska Native corporations, the native sort of analogous to Indian tribes. And to hear the issues that they were dealing with, you know, in terms of not having a written language or not having, you know, ability to get ballots during the November when the ponds were too soft to dog sled over but too hard to canoe through. I mean, literally, this is what we heard.
You have to have weapons in the polling places for polar bears. Right?
Well, they're protected species. But so there are good reasons, right, for federalism and diversity concerns, that is to say, sort of local cultural reasons, not to have national laws on a lot of different dimensions. Nevertheless, we have rallied together to have national laws in certain circumstances, whether it's the Help America Vote Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Uniform Overseas Citizen Voting Act, right? All of those, you know, were responses to national problems. Cybersecurity is one of those, right? We have, like I said before, we have a nation that attacked our electoral system. We need a nation to respond to it. That doesn't mean that we're going to be micromanaging every aspect of the election infrastructure in these states. But when it comes to security, you need something akin to the GRU to confront the GRU, right? And so that's why whether, you know, DHS, I think it's good that they continue to designate the election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, and we need to have, you know, expansive cybersecurity assistance for the localities. Something that I think is low-hanging fruit here, by the way, is, because this is something where I think the Republicans and Democrats can get together, is to enable political parties to go beyond the current restrictions in terms of financial donations to candidates. Because right now, with respect to cybersecurity, right, so that right now the political parties are hindered in their ability to provide in-kind assistance to the candidate campaigns by the campaign finance laws. I would just like blow that door completely open. Ron Wyden has a bill in that is trying to deal with that, at least to allow the parties to use their infrastructure fund for cyber infrastructure. That seems to me like a political no-brainer, right? That you ought to be able to have the political parties secure the campaigns. You can understand why candidates might be a little reluctant to have the DHS come in and protect them, but the political parties are the only sort of continuous institutions in these sort of campaigns and elections. And so they ought to be able to provide, you know, robust cybersecurity assistance to the campaigns. And that goes for some outside groups as well. So there's the federalism argument, and then there is the partisan issue as well. But, you know, we shouldn't have to have a bipartisan disaster for there to be a bipartisan solution here, right? One of the reasons we try to express the sort of faceted concerns that we have from around the world, which is to say that it's not just a Russian problem, but you need to think about the Iranians, you need to think about the Chinese, you need to think about other non-state actors and how they might have an impact on our elections, is that the Democrats and the Republicans are vulnerable here. And so that we need a bipartisan solution to get at this.
I think we have a follow-up here. Get the mic coming right here.
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. With our partners, the National Governors Association, we in fact are working with the states to do workshops in states on cybersecurity and elections. In your recommendations in Section 2, you talk about low-hanging fruit, as you would say, two-factor authentication. What are some of the other things that state and county election officials should know, especially since we know bad things will happen, misinformation will be there? What should state and county officials be doing?
Specifically in the context of election infrastructure stuff? Well, I mean, there's so many, I mean, part of this, it begins with regularizing auditing of all aspects of the election infrastructure, right from the voter registration all through the counting, right? There's a substantial number of counties in the U.S. that don't go through that, right? And as we know, you know, the cybersecurity, with respect to administrative expertise generally, but cybersecurity expertise in particular, there is an incredible range among the counties in the U.S., right? And it's, by the way, it's not necessarily the ones that you would expect are the experts, right? It's not like all the well-funded counties or the big counties are the ones who are the best at this. It's really quite diverse, right? A lot of it has to do with the funding streams that they're getting and the like. And we hope that this report, like the Presidential Commission on Election Administration report, can be used by localities to sort of lobby their states to get better funding to go after these problems. But it really begins, I mean, like I said, each one of those technical components in the voting infrastructure has to be addressed by the localities. And, you know, yes, things like two-factor authentication, securing the email lists of your employees, right? All the kind of cyber hygiene stuff that we talk about there and that, you know, people like Alex talk about all the time.
I would say a key part of that is cloudification and centralization on a per state basis, right? Like the idea, Miami-Dade is never going to have a security team that can stand up to SVR. They're just not. Right? Like, it's not going to happen. But the state of Florida, could they operate services on behalf of multiple counties, centralized tech services? And that is the most positive thing that has happened for security in the enterprise world, in the private sector, has been the ability for companies to move to Google and Microsoft and Salesforce and Amazon to other people's infrastructure, where there are shared teams of very competent people that can amortize the security cost across many different customers. We need to move to the same thing with election infrastructure. You should not have an individual county, should not be buying some Windows software that they run on SQL Server, on local unpatched Windows servers in a closet in the county. Like, that should be professionally maintained cloud software run by the state or perhaps by consortiums between multiple states or private organizations under oversight from those states. And so moving towards more eggs in fewer baskets, while it sounds wrong, I think is what is going to be important right now. I feel like the election people are going through what we went through in private industry about 10 years ago, where everybody was like, cloud's bad because you're putting it all in one place. But you're putting it all in one place where there's actually competent people. So having like 1,000 lesser competent organizations versus 20 competent, it turns out 20 competent is a better move.
And I would just add, I do think, I don't want to minimize the threat, but the penetration of these systems, these voter registration systems in a few places was, at least for far as we know, mostly getting in and looking around. But I do want to put in perspective what people sometimes think is happening or is likely to happen, and that is when you go on an online voter registration system, which we, and the commission thought was a very good idea, you're not automatically changing the voter registration database, right? You're putting something in, there's a sort of delay, a check. Sometimes it involves county look, sometimes it involves checks against your eligibility. There are procedures in place as to mailing out to you at an old or new address that you might have changed something. Of course, there's provisional ballots at the end of the day to allow people who have problems to get through. There's a log of what's happened and being able to get back to where you were before. So all of these things could be improved, all of these areas. But I do want to stress that it isn't so simple to think that there's this access to this database directly from these portals, which are creating a lot of good. Building on those points which are already there to sort of strengthen the knowledge that something might be going on and the ability to correct after the fact. I mean, that's all there.
Can I add one sort of aspect of this that we almost never think about, which is just the simple election night reporting infrastructure and how that is something we sort of don't think about in the kind of election infrastructure language, but just the state websites and the local websites about vote tallies. Now, that would always be resolved sometime later on because there are backups and you can think about this. But if there's a difference, right, then you can think about how in a kind of environment of doubt, how that could play out. I can tell you that there are folks in the different communities that we work with are really concerned about that.
Imagine Fox and MSNBC calling one county for two different ways. Like you'd have conspiracy theories forever. It doesn't matter.
Okay, we're going to turn to another question. Let's move this side of the room. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bill Sweeney. I know both of the gentlemen. Congratulations on a great report, a great document, and very valuable in so many ways. But you've got 45 recommendations over 7 areas. And some of those 45 recommendations are paragraphs of 3 or 4 recommendations within each. We're about a year out. What do we do now? What do we do first? How do you take all of this and turn some of it into actionable items by our political system in time for this election?
I mean, we did our part. We wrote it down. And we printed it for you? Like, what else do you want?
It's even on the internet.
It's even on the internet, yeah.
Well, so there's, I mean, one of the important things about this report, I think, which makes it different than, say, like our PCA report or the National Academy of Sciences report, is that there are different audiences for this, right? And there are different movers, right? And so there are things that could happen now that the social media companies could reform. There are changes to the ads network and ads library and their APIs that could be done now. And I know that there are going to be changes that they're going to be thinking about in the next few months, and I'm confident actually that something's going to happen there. When it comes to the voting infrastructure stuff, I think there's going to be some changes, but in some ways we're too late, right? I mean, there are certain, it's going to be very difficult a year out, because the primaries are a year out, to buy new voting machines, right? There are some states that are doing that, and we want to sort of give support to them. Developing cyber expertise among the counties, and to try to convince states to provide more funding and to throw some love DHS's way, so that people listen to them. I think that's something that is achievable. With respect to, say, the foreign broadcasters, there's already been sort of movement in that area, so I think that we just want to codify that and make sure that that's true going forward. I mean, there's other things that we, this point about funding cybersecurity assistance that I was taking, like for the campaigns, that is something that Congress should pass tomorrow, right? I mean, that really is something that, especially if you just want to say you're doing something, right? That is a pretty easy thing, I think, for them to do, because it doesn't require spending any money. It just gives permission to the parties to provide for some security. And those are sort of things that were on my list. But
yeah, I mean, I agree that the stuff, we have a bunch of recommendations for the companies that they can do voluntarily. They need to be backed up by legislation. One of the emerging themes that you see is that there's like 1,000 companies with user-generated content or that run online ads. 2 of them have done anything, right? And it's because it's not legally required, and only 2 of them are getting any attention. So, but those 2 can still do more, but eventually we do need legislation to back it up and to encourage standards through IAB and DAA and other standards bodies to back up the entire ecosystem.
Something else, another recommendation we haven't talked about is the building of a community among the, an ISOC or ISAC,
yeah.
Among the internet companies to deal with this in the same way they deal with child exploitation, anti-terrorism content, and the like. There is, I mean, maybe you can say this, talk about this now that you're no longer in the Valley, but let me loft it to you, which is that there is an allergy among certain social media companies and internet companies to be joined at the hip with Facebook, because Facebook has basically been taking the hits, and they're thrilled that they're standing in front and taking it, right? But we know that this is a cross-platform problem, and it's especially true among the small firms, right, where the foreign actors then migrate in order to achieve certain ends when the more sophisticated intelligence operations at the big firms get them, right? I mean, you could even talk, that's something that's not, I think, well known in DC that you might want to talk about.
We're operating off actually a really bad set of data. Like, we have a serious data sampling issue, in that we only know about Russian activity on websites that have full-time intelligence teams. So effectively, everything you read in the Mueller report about what they did on Facebook, Google, and Twitter came from Facebook, Google, and Twitter, right? Like, when I was reading that, there's no surprises about what happened to Facebook, because our team found it and turned it over voluntarily. We're not legally required to do that. We did it because we wanted to. Same with Google and Twitter. There are 1,000 other websites that don't have that. So we don't know actually what the Russians did, because the government does not have the legal capability to compel the kind of investigation that's necessary to figure that out. And so that's one of the reasons why we call for an organization that the big companies can help the small ones. I don't think the small ones want this, but the truth is Reddit can't go do what I did, which is like hire ex-NSA Russian-speaking disinformation experts, right? Like, that is not within the realm of capability for for Pinterest, right? Like, and so we need to build a capability across the industry to help them out, but that requires all of the big companies to play, and there's at least one big company especially that's been dragging their feet because they're keeping their heads down. Fortunately, they're starting to take enough PR fire that I think their attitude might change a little bit.
Okay. Why don't we go way in the back there? Here? Yep.
Thank you. Hello? Is it on? Okay. My name's Rotem. I'm here with the American Bar Association. I just had a quick question. I was really interested in your discussion specifically with the hyper-targeting of ads and the relationship between the hyper-targeting of ads and the role of billionaire organizations with advertisements. That, as well as in the aftermath of court cases like Citizens United, I was wondering what thoughts you had on how the government should intervene in limiting the amount of money that you can spend in advertising, and as well as the amount of money that you can give to political campaigns, and how that would influence free speech on the internet, which you call the Wild West. Government cannot limit the amount of money that can be spent in campaigns. That is Citizens United as well as before Citizens United, right? And so, and I should say that it is going to be increasingly difficult, even if we lived in a different world, to limit the ability of groups, corporations, unions, individuals to spend money on campaigns. I mean, take as an example, it was always one thing if you were paying volunteers and you could see, who was going out and canvassing for you. But what does it mean to hire a bot army? Right, something the founders didn't really think about right at the time. What did James Madison think about Twitter bots? And so there's, we should put that to one side. You're not going to be able to limit the amount of money that's spent in campaigns. The platforms, of course, are not bound by the First Amendment, which is to say if they want to adopt McCain-Feingold, even as overturned by Citizens United, they could make a decision not to allow corporations to spend money on the platform and the like. In addition, a law against micro-targeting, I think, is also unconstitutional, right? Because for the same reason that you can't prevent me from deciding individuals to give messages to, right? You can't prevent a campaign from doing that. However, one area that's sort of overlooked in the campaign finance world when it comes to Citizens United is that portion of Citizens United that received 8 out of the 9 votes on the Supreme Court, and that has to do with disclosure, right? A lot of the issues dealing with Russian interference could be dealt with through disclosure. Not because you as a consumer of political information or political advertising pay attention to, I'm Nate personally and I support this message. It's because if you have a disclosure regime, it then deters certain types of clandestine actors from participating. And so that's true with micro-targeting, that's true with spending in the election and the like. I wrote an article a while ago on how the level of disclosure should be calibrated to micro-targeting, right? So that the more particular your message to individuals, the better that the disclosure should be. With the combination of AI and machine learning with advertising, we are going to see more and more of these kind of slicing of the electorate. It also becomes very challenging to develop an ad library that has 100,000 variations on an ad to really understand what's going on. But that's where the terrain has to happen. So you can have some regulation on disclosure here, I think, to make sure that we know what's actually going on.
Okay. I think right here. Yeah, I think so.
Hi, thank you. Dan Weiner with the Brennan Center for Justice. One aspect of your report that we found really interesting, because it's something we've been thinking about a lot, is how we define legislative issues of national importance. As someone who used to work at the Federal Election Commission, I'm going to tell you that the proposal that you give that to the FEC to do filled me with a small amount of trepidation. Yeah. So I guess maybe could you outline a little bit more what the process of our friends at the FEC defining these issues would actually look like?
Because the commissioners would all agree.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I actually had in there originally that we should have any 3 commissioners could decide on 10 issues, was what originally that I was thinking. So here's the problem, right? And we just need to wrestle with this, which is, do we want politics to be defined by corporations or by government, right? And that is really the nature of the problem here. Because if the government doesn't do it, then we're leaving it up to Facebook and Google. And what's happened, I don't know if I mentioned...
actually. It's this weird Facebook contractual thing. I like how you're pointing to.
Well, this is one of the interesting... let's just give a little bit of history here, which is that the Facebook transparency regime, when it comes to advertising, is reverse engineered to get at the Russia problem, okay? And since the Russia problem really was not about candidate ads, although there were some ads. Roughly 80% of those ads were not mentioning a candidate. So if you're going to try to get at that, you have to find some way to define what is political. And I agree. I'm not happy with this, but if I have to choose between a democratically accountable actor, which is say government, versus the firms being the ones to define it, I would want the government to deal with this. There are many different ways we could think about how the FEC or some other body could try to be in that business. This is the most fraught area. You know, regulation of issue advocacy is about as close to the core of First Amendment as you can imagine. But that's why we're only talking about disclosure here, right? That you have some kind of transparency regime to deal with what is political. And so, you know, either it's going to be Facebook and those folks. And I should say, Google has not gone in that direction. Google does not require transparency for issue advocacy. It's just Facebook right now. And I got to say, I think Google's thrilled that they didn't go down that rabbit hole because it's proven.
They're thrilled now. They're not going to be thrilled after it turns out there's a disinformation campaign on those same topics.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it happened already to them. I mean, that was 2016 with them as well. I mean, the problem, I think I said this before, right? It potentially sweeps in the media organizations. It gets at like
which is fine. Which, like, the media organizations love to complain about when the rules are applied to them, but they're asking for control of political ads. They have to live with it, and the outcome is like one person has to send in a photo of their driver's license. Yeah. I mean, you're not talking about like licensing the media. You're saying like you have to verify that you are an American organization and that there's one person who's able to speak on your behalf. Yeah, well, the media complaints about the political advertising is the best example that this is mostly special pleading and that they're not actually concerned about the problem overall. Sorry, but it's pretty silly.
So anyway, that's one of the consequences here, right? But if you think about this from a constitutional standpoint, right, the fact that the media gets swept into an issue advocacy restriction makes a difference, right? And so, I mean, that was one of the things, you know, the Citizens United opinion itself spends a lot of time talking about media corporations for a reason. And so,
even if it doesn't, all it requires is for you to verify who you are.
No, I think it is constitutional. Look, I'm behind that. I mean, people in this room who've heard me several times come here talking about campaign finance are surprised to see this provision in that report because, generally speaking, you know, I'm pretty libertarian on campaign finance issues. But we're in this unique moment in American history right now where the decision is being made, right? The question is whether you're going to have the companies be the one that decided or you're going to have the government. And so now we have to think about some governmental entity. Sure, we can manufacture something like the FEC to be in charge of this problem. They happen to be the regulator in this area, so it makes sense that they would be the ones to do it. But we have to, you know, we have to make that decision. Now, this is one of those areas where Zuckerberg has said, look, we need to be regulated, right? Take this decision out of our hands, not just in the US, but around the world, because everybody is expecting Facebook to go after something like the Russian advertising. And so whether it's the FEC or another body, we need some kind of democratically accountable actor that's going to define what the kind of universe of ads is that requires disclosure.
It's where I really am concerned then about the contagion effect to other countries then too. About some of these definitions being used to suppress minority candidates.
That's why it's disclosure, right? It's about disclosure of just going back to your hierarchy, right? This is only on the most amplifying of paid expression that we're talking about it.
Yeah. All right, time for one last crisp question. You're here, short.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the report and for being here today.
You know, you're in D.C. when people are complimenting you for your report. That's what
Well, it's very useful for what I'm doing. I'm Todd Bell from George Washington University. I'm at the Graduate School of Political Management, where our students are going out to work in advocacy and electoral campaigns. We've just started a course on ensuring data security. And so I'd like to hear any suggestions, quickly, that you would have for students who are going to work on that side of politics.
Oh, put it all in the cloud. Like, run nothing on, put it all in the cloud and give limited computing devices to all the people who work for the campaign. There's no reason for anybody in the campaign except a couple of graphic designers to have a Windows machine or a Mac. Everybody gets a Pixelbook, right? Everybody gets a Chromebook. Everybody's on G Suite. Nobody has the ability to install any software. Everybody, you know, you can have iOS devices and a handful of Android devices with MDM. Two-factor everything. Use Duo is probably the best and easiest two-factor for that. sign a contract with a SIEM company and a CASB. So go find a security company that holds all your logs for you so you can do incident response, and then build an incident response relationship up front. So when something weird happens, they help you within an hour, not within 2 days. That's the other thing that, like the difference between organizations that catch and stop bad guys versus the ones that read about it in the Wall Street Journal are the ones that catch and stop bad guys can react within minutes, right? And the vast majority of political campaigns can't do that. And this is where I think the DNC thing's totally, like the DNC and RNC should be the people who have the ability to do this. We need to change the law, but until that happens, they need to pre-build a relationship with one of a number of companies so that those people have access to the data, they have the contracts in place, they have the NDAs in place, they've paid a retainer, and they have the ability to respond fast enough that if there's a bad guy in the network, they can kick him off fast enough before they're able to get 10,000 emails out.
And to end where we began, this is one of the reasons I love having Alex at Stanford right now, right? Which is that this is the kind of thing that in academic environments we haven't been spending a whole lot of time thinking about. Most of the kind of cybersecurity academic interest is at the real kind of advanced, almost theoretical stage, right? And to start thinking about how the platforms are being abused by people who are using them as intended, as well as developing basic cyber hygiene and cybersecurity policies that'll have a really big bang for the buck is one of the reasons I'm thrilled he's joined us.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Alex Stamos and Nate Persily and Stanford University.